I should warn you all that we spoke backstage about this, and we went well over 20 minutes because there's so much to get into when we talk about the future of Silicon Valley. But I think we're going to start with Gill, because you are one of the great pioneers of Silicon Valley. Why don't you take us back and tell us how it began and how it's changed?
Well, I'm delighted to. First of all, it is a real honor and a privilege to be here with you today. And the concept of Silicon Valley is not just placed geographically, but it's an idea. It's a concept that we built. And it started a long time ago with, interestingly enough, with the invention of the transistor by William Shockley at Bell Laboratories. And the invention of the transistor was determined at the end of the 20th century to be the most important invention of the 20th century. I would say that there was a few things that should have been added to that list, and I'll comment on those as I go through that. Things like the invention of the integrated circuit, and frankly, something that I invented, the CCD, which is the sensor that is in every cell phone, every television camera, every astronomy, and is also the sensor for the Hubble Space Telescope. And I invented that when I was at Bell Laboratories in 1968. And it has changed the world in many, many ways, as I'm sure you all realize. How did it all start? Well, like I said, it started with Bill Shockley. Bill, once he won the Nobel Prize for his invention of the transistor, started to become a professor at Stanford University, which is now right next to what we call Silicon Valley. And he split his time between lecturing at Stanford and working at AT&T. Now, when I got my PhD in physics, I went to Bell Laboratories. I was invited to go to Bell Laboratories. And Bill Shockley was my mentor. He was my teacher. And I learned an awful lot from him. He once upon a time told me that he thought I was the smartest guy he ever met, which was a great exaggeration. But I think that was an indication that he really liked me a lot. And what he said to me one day was, "Gill, you ought to go and help us build Silicon Valley." And so I ultimately went there. Now, who were the key players in this? When Bill first started what was called Shockley Labs, he hired a few people. One was Bob Noyce, Gordon Moore, Andy Grove, to run a company called Shockley Labs. Now, that was the first semiconductor company in Silicon Valley. Bill Shockley, for all his brilliance, however, was not a very good businessman. And pretty soon, his team got very frustrated, and they went off and started a new company called Fairchild Semiconductor, which was created through an investment by Sherman Fairchild, an entrepreneur and investor of that era. And so Fairchild Semiconductor got started, and it was the first true semiconductor company there. I went to work there rather early in the development there, and I was the second in command of the R&D on all of the R&D work there. The fellow who ran it was a gentleman named Jim Early, and Jim Early took Bill Shockley's invention of the transistor, and he improved upon it and made it even an even better device than the original device that Bill invented, and that became what we built on. So these people were the critical pioneers, and there were many others, but I would say that what was unique about Silicon Valley was the following. We were technically the various companies that made up Silicon Valley, like Fairchild, Intel, National Semiconductor, et cetera, and others. In theory, we were competitors, but in practice, we really weren't competitors. And in fact, we would get together every Friday night at a little bar called the Wagon Wheel, right in the heart of Silicon Valley, and we would sit around and talk about, well, what did you discover this week? What did you invent this week? What's new? And we would share all these ideas with one another. And that was, that ultimately evolved to a once every 3 month meeting held in Palo Alto, where we all got together and exchanged all our technology ideas. So we were cooperating with one another and teaching one another, but we were also competitors. And so someone came up with the idea of giving that kind of management a name, and they called it co-opetition. You cooperated, but you also competed with one another. And co-opetition is what built Silicon Valley, the fact that we were willing to openly share ideas and discoveries with one another, because we were on a mission to do something much more important than just build our individual companies. We wanted to change the world, which I think is pretty evident that was wildly successful in doing that. What's the lesson from this? I think the lesson from this is the following. As I said earlier, Silicon Valley is more of a concept than it is a geographical place. And it's time for that concept to go global. Everyone ought to have, every major sovereign nation ought to have their own Silicon Valley. And they should follow the history of what the real Silicon Valley, the original Silicon Valley did, in the same ways of being cooperative, open, yet nonetheless competing at the end of the day in an economic sense. And I think if all nations did that, we would be able to move to new levels of capabilities and inventions and prosperity for all of the citizens of our planet. And that's really what it's all about. If you're here at this global summit, what are we here for? We're here to make the world a better place and learn from one another. And that really is the lesson that was taught to us by Silicon Valley. So what are the things we should be focusing on as we move into the future? Let me give you my short list of the things that I think are really, really important for us to start working on together. Number one continues to be mobile communications. Mobile communications got started, as you know, with the invention of the mobile phone, the smartphone, and which was dramatically enhanced by the work that Steve Jobs and I did at Apple, where the iPhone was invented. There's a funny story I was sharing with my colleagues here this morning about how that happened. I had been focused on making something that I thought would help medical hospitals and other medical locations by a device that would make it easier for the nurses who had to go to the rooms of the patients, where they had to take their blood pressure and check their temperature and do other things like that. They would write it down on a piece of paper, and then at the end of their shift, they would go and they would type all of this into the computer. And I said, why can't we make a device that when you go to the patient's room, an electronic device, you can just punch it all in there and it automatically updates the central computer with all of the information on all of the patients. So I told that to Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs said to me, he says, well, gee, Gill, that's a great idea, but why don't we just make it a phone? And I said, dummy me, that's exactly what we should do. And so we made the iPhone. Now, I was on the board of AT&T at the time, so obviously AT&T became the first producer of that phone and the first service that you could get on that. And of course, now it's gone totally global.
Now we all have a phone.
That's the way it was.
I'm going to jump in there, Gill.
So,
when we look at Silicon Valley OG as it exists today, Stan, what do you think the issues are at the moment? And I'll ask this to you as well, Jeff. Why has Silicon Valley lost some of its glitter of late?
I think we have gotten too involved in social media, in my opinion. I think that merely communicating, it's a great thing to communicate in parallel. I'm all for that. But what it's become now is something that doesn't actually produce anything new.
So perhaps we've gone too far down that path. What do you think?
So, couple of things on that. So Silicon Valley is definitely at the place of changing. But when I think about it, I'm actually incredibly optimistic about the future and about all the changes that are coming, because changes are to some extent prerequisite of living. And as you all probably can derive from everything what you heard from Gill, Silicon Valley was constantly changing from the moment it's arrived to the world in the forms that we know it today. And the only thing that doesn't change is the thing that is dead. Any change is good for anything is living, and the way I think about it is that sort of the only constant thing about any living organism is constant change that it experiences. And Silicon Valley is right in the middle of that, and every single change that we have experienced to date ended up turning it into a bigger place or bigger ideas than it used to be before. And there are multiple examples of that. Everyone is talking about AI these days, but where that whole thing initiated, the companies that everyone is talking about when people are talking about AI is obviously OpenAI, but it's very much Silicon Valley company. It's very much the same people involved who were involved in so many other things in Silicon Valley. And so the new great platform still comes from that place and from that way of thinking. So I actually don't think that the idea of replicating Silicon Valley all over the world is the right idea. What it is, the right idea, is expanding and scaling Silicon Valley to the rest of the world. When people in Dubai or people in Estonia or people in Africa are thinking the same way that people in Silicon Valley are thinking, and when they are actually connecting themselves with the ether of Silicon Valley, scaling the whole idea to the rest of the world versus trying to preserve it in one place is what's going to drive innovation of tomorrow, in my understanding.
I agree.
Yeah, I'll add to that I don't think that there's anything, I don't think that Silicon Valley has actually lost its glitter. I know there's housing pricing issues and there's valuation issues in companies and there's issues that Silicon Valley has that other cities and other ecosystems have around the world. I think what instead is happening is that you're seeing the globalization that we're talking about. And so it's not necessarily that Silicon Valley has lost its glitter, it's that it's not the only place where innovation is happening now. I mean, you know, and what Silicon Valley does very, very well, and I don't know if we talk about this enough, is that Silicon Valley celebrates the entrepreneur, celebrates the inventor, celebrates the creator, the innovator. Whereas, you know, if you were to go around in the US today and say, hey, what do you think venture capital is? Probably most people, if you just walked out on the street, I bet most people would say, oh, isn't it that like Shark Tank thing and Mr. Wonderful and Mark Cuban? That's what venture capital is, right? And so it's this thing where capital has become the hot commodity, and it's become the popularization of what entrepreneurship is and what Silicon Valley is. But Silicon Valley at its core remembers and always celebrates that the real driver of innovation is the entrepreneur. Capital is a commodity. It's all about the creators. And so I'd say, you know, 2018 was the first or the last year that more than half of global venture capital was invested inside the US. After that, it's been more than half has been invested outside the U.S., which again is a representation of what Stan's saying, that the globalization of creation is happening right now. So I don't think it's that Silicon Valley's lost its glitter. I think that glitter is being spread for the betterment of society all over the world.
I agree with that, and I would just like to add one thing. What is it that we will be focusing on in this new globalized version of Silicon Valley? And I have a short list here that I think are the things that are to watch for in terms of where new innovation is going. as I said earlier, we'll continue to have mobile communications will continue to be a megatrend for the indefinite future. But in addition to that, perhaps the most important thing that's going to happen over the next 20 or 30 years is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence will change everything. And we have to be careful to do it right, to do it carefully. But the invention of cognitive artificial intelligence, conversational artificial intelligence, where you can actually carry on a conversation with a machine, in effect, like you would with another person. That's basically here today. It's getting better all the time, but you can even do that today. One of the companies I have in my portfolio actually has that technology that you can sit down and actually have a conversation with an artificial intelligence device. The other areas, I think, will be health and safety. We want to make a world a safer place, and I think there are technologies we can develop that will do that. I think that will be a big focus. In the health area, we need new compounds that help people address all the illnesses we have today. Again, I have helped founded a company called Galectin Therapeutics that focuses on cancer and fibrosis. And it is not a drug that we make. We make a compound that what it actually does is enhances your immune system to cure you. And when your immune system cures you, you have no side effects. So the future in biotech is going to be developing these kind of compounds that empower your immune system to do the job of making you and keeping you well. And I think that's going to be a very exciting evolution in the coming years. Smart energy, everyone, I think, probably today understands that energy is what powers the world. All of that energy comes from the sun. How do we capture it? How do we distribute it more efficiently? Right now, about half of all the energy generated on the planet is lost in transmission. And we can do a better job than that. I think there's room for lots of innovation and technology here that I think you will see developing over the next couple of three decades. And then finally, one of my favorites is what I call a user-centric platform. And that is ways of communicating around the world and literally building virtual businesses online where you can have whatever product it is you make. You basically have a store that's available to everyone all over the world, and what they will do is they'll literally make virtual stores that you'll be able to virtually walk into and shop like you would in a physical store, and that will become a new way of shopping for everyone over these years. So these are just a few of those things that are coming, but I think it's a great opportunity for the nations of the world to get on board, to become a part of developing these new innovations and technologies, and frankly make the whole world a more harmonious and safer and friendlier place. So.
Well, given that you came up with the basic idea behind the kind of cell phone, I think we will always listen to what you have to say in terms of the future. One area that we haven't really spoken about, though, is the silicon in Silicon Valley. And maybe that is something you'd like to pick up on, Jeff.
I'm sorry.
For Jeff, on silicon.
Jeff, yes.
You just got a Silicon Valley history lesson from someone that lived it. I mean, I think that I just wanted to sit here and listen to this too. I think what's interesting about the silicon in Silicon Valley is that it started with exactly who Gill's talking about, Shockley and Noyce and Moore, where Moore's law comes from. The refocus on the fabrication of silicon or the semiconductors is a huge emphasis. We've seen the CHIPS Act happen just in the United States back in 2022, just last year, which is going to re-emphasize continued R&D and fabrication of semiconductors in the U.S. I think any country that focuses on this is going to be focusing on the future of the backbone that is going to enable all this innovation. I think innovation in this area, chips being cheaper, faster, are going to help all the other things that we want to do in the world. You know, there's problems in the world that haven't been able to be solved yet because of technologies, big problems. Problems like energy and healthcare and water and food and these things that we're addressing them now, but as chips get smarter, faster, cheaper, based on the investments of semiconductors, we're going to be able to solve the world's greatest problems even more. So I think the silicon in Silicon Valley, we're seeing it from the CHIPS Act, is going to be incredibly important.
And a great example of the US government really intervening to almost try and reinvigorate Silicon Valley. Stan, I'm going to end with you. I found this quote from you. I've been working nonstop since I was 16 with about 2 weeks break between my projects, starting companies, starting a venture fund, running companies, merging companies, investing in companies, and working at companies. Please tell me you've had a break. And do you think we can draw a parallel between your career, I guess, and the fast, high-growth phase that we have had from Silicon Valley? And are we entering a new phase?
Well, I do think that we are entering a new phase, but, and I now keep thinking, where did you get that quote from?
Did you have a break?
But look, here's, and it's probably topical for the forums that we are in. I think the role of the government, and to the earlier question you asked about the government in Silicon Valley, the role of the government is generally very simple, which is to set up objectives, number one, long-term objectives, where you want the whole thing to go. The second, to set up incentives to make sure that incentives are right from the standpoint of that ecosystem continuing to develop and moving in the right direction. And then third, to get out of the way as long as the objective is intact and as long as incentives are working. And actually, not Silicon Valley point, but I think Dubai, and this is my first time here, is doing amazingly just in that. A long time ago, there was an objective set up, incentives was set up, and through thin and thick, and of course our ups and downs are always there, the government just stuck with that paradigm, and everything what we see around us today, when I'm driving, I'm just blown away, it's because of that. Silicon Valley, very much as a place and as an idea, was benefit of the same type of forces. And going forward, I think it's really important, whether we are talking about government going back and incentivizing semiconductor production in the US, or the way government is looking at how to regulate software and how to regulate different things. I think it's very important that we continue on that trajectory where government is there to help and support and regulate and make sure that bad actors are not allowed to play, but at the same time, it's not looking at innovation as some dangerous thing that needs to be prevented from happening. And I think making sure that we continue to draw that line and continue to help our elected officials or unelected officials to continue on that path is going to be one of the most important things that we all as a society can do to ensure that innovation continues to happen at the same speed as it was happening in the last 50 years.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. We have gone well over time, which was predictable, frankly. We have so much to talk about. I could talk about it for about an hour. But I think we'll end actually with what Gill said right at the beginning. Silicon Valley is just a concept. And as you say, it's something you see recreated very much in Dubai. But thank you all for that wonderful session. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.